Well, good morning to you from Texas. I'm Daniel Ray, staff apologist with Watchman Fellowship. Thank you for joining me. Today, we are filming this in the morning, and it is a beautiful, almost spring morning here in Texas. And if you have some coffee or tea, join me as we have, I hope, what will be a delightful and informative chat about Dr. Carl Sagan. Now, Dr. Sagan was a planetary astronomer at Cornell University. He was the host of the very popular 1980 TV series Cosmos that appeared on PBS. He is an author, he is a gifted communicator, a science popularizer, a father, and we're going to be reviewing today part of a lecture that he gave on his 60th birthday at Cornell University in 1994. When Cosmos came out, I was 12. Dr. Sagan was very influential in getting me interested in stars and astronomy and the universe. I was not a very good student, so I didn't do mathematics or science very well, but I loved the subject. I just wasn't good at crunching numbers. But I ended up writing this book a couple of years ago. It came out in July of 2019, The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. And it's opened up a lot of wonderful doors and having a lot of great conversations and podcasts and interviews with people. I've even had the wonderful privilege of interviewing Dr. Sagan's daughter, Sasha, and I'll share some of those clips with you today. Tragically, Dr. Sagan died in 1996 at the age of 62 on December 20th, and he is laid to rest at Lakeview Cemetery in Ithaca, New York, with a very nondescript and modest headstone. It's actually kind of beautiful. Now, a lot of people say that Dr. Sagan was an atheist, but he never identified as an atheist. I even asked his daughter, Sasha, did your dad ever identify as an atheist?
Yeah, I think that, he was a scientist. And again, maybe there's a word missing here for what it's called when your worldview is science. And I would just say he would say that he would withhold belief without evidence. And so, I don't think that he would have described himself as being an atheist in the sense of having total conviction that there was no God.
Here's what Dr. Sagan himself has said about this. He says, an atheist is someone who is certain that God does not exist, someone who has compelling evidence against the existence of God. I know of no such compelling evidence because God can be relegated to remote times and places and to ultimate causes. We would have to know a great deal more about the universe than we do know to be sure that no such God exists. To be certain of the existence of God and to be certain of the non-existence of God seem to me to be the confident extremes in a subject so riddled with doubt and uncertainty as to inspire very little confidence indeed. And so Dr. Sagan never identified himself as an atheist. He just believed there was insufficient evidence for the existence of God. So today we are just going to be reviewing some of the claims and things that Dr. Sagan said in his 1994 Cornell lecture. What's in this video? What are we going to talk about? Briefly, I don't pretend to be exhaustive. It's just going to be touching on a few points and responding to some of the things that he says in the video. And I hopefully will be doing this respectfully. I mean, I love Dr. Sagan in one sense, but I disagree with a lot of his scientific materialism and naturalism that he espouses in the other sense. So we're going to be talking today in this video about reverence from the stars, the Great Bear, Ursa Major, and constellations in general, DNA, chimps, and humans, evolution, Dr. Sagan's idea of scientific technology, who we are as human beings, Copernicus and Galileo, and of course, the famous pale blue dot. So the first thing Dr. Sagan mentions here is, I want to play this short clip about what he says about looking up at the stars.
So over the dying embers of the campfire, people watched the stars. And they did it, I imagine, for many reasons. One, it is just dazzling. And we today living in under polluted skies and in cities with light pollution have mainly forgotten how gorgeous the night sky can be. It is not only an aesthetic experience, but it elicits, unbidden, feelings of reverence and awe.
So why reverence and awe? What are we revering? Just helium and hydrogen? Balls of gas? What are we revering? Why reverence? Well, I think simply that what Dr. Sagan here is saying affirms what the scriptures say, that in Psalm 19, the heavens are declaring the glory of God and the skies above show forth his handiwork. And so we are looking at the work of a king representing his kingdom, revealing his invisible attributes, as Romans 1 says, that we can know by looking at what God has created, we can know what God is like, his power, his majesty, his lordship, his creativity, wisdom, all of that combined, God has built into the fabric of the cosmos so that we recognize it. And so when Dr. Sagan says reverence and awe, I think this is exactly what Scripture says, that we are picking up on God's invisible attributes. The artist puts his personality into what he has created. I want to play a little clip here about how Dr. Sagan believes constellations came to be.
People made up stories about the stars. They invented Rorschach tests up there, follow the dots, constellations. Look like a bear to you, Og. Yes, I guess it does. And then forced their children to memorize these absolutely arbitrary patterns. I don't see the bear's tail, Dad. Shut up. And then myths were invented either before or after. So these were visual reminders of stories. The bear ate your grandpa, something like that, was put up in heaven as an example. Or there was the story first, and then people put the bears up there.
So was the Great Bear, Ursa Major, one of the most predominantly recognizable constellations that we have today? Well, it's recognizable only in part. We know the Big Dipper. If you've seen the Big Dipper, you've seen part of Ursa Major. The Big Dipper is an asterism. It's part of the Great Bear. It's not the whole thing. But we all could probably recognize the Big Dipper in the night sky. So is Ursa Major the constellation of the Great Bear? Did that come about through Og at a campfire? For some prehistoric individuals looking up at the stars and going, that looks like a bear. Does that look like a bear? It looks like a bear. Does that look like a bear? Is that really how this story of the bear came to be? Or constellations in general? Now I want to share a quote with you from Clive Ruggles' work, Ancient Astronomy. And Clive says this, quote, "The general idea of a bear, or bears in the sky, is widespread, especially in northern latitudes. A variety of traditions, folk tales, public performances, and shamanic rituals involving terrestrial bears and connected to a celestial bear exist among cultures scattered throughout Europe and the northernmost parts of Asia and the Americas." Clive goes on to say, "It is more mystifying why anyone would conceive them to be bears." I mean, look at these star patterns. You can't recognizably see right away that there's a bear there. So why the idea of a bear? In North America, for example, the Onondaga, the Cherokee, the Blackfoot, the Zuni, the Eskimo, the Micmac saw Ursa Major as a bear pursued by hunters. And in our Greco-Roman mythologies and constellation lore, we have Ursa Major as well, coming from stories about Zeus and his infidelity and antics and things of that nature. So why would the Greco-Roman world and the North American native tribes have this idea that this group of stars would be a bear? Is that just from somebody sitting around a campfire millions of years ago? So the question is, why would civilizations that had no prior contact with each other conclude that this grouping of stars would be a bear? Maybe there's something else to it than just some people sitting around a campfire millions of years ago. Now, of course, just offering this as my hypothesis, there is someone who created bears and put them in the Arctic. So the one who created the stars also created the bears in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And by the way, Arctic means bear-like, and Antarctic means no bears. So if you go down to Antarctica, you're going to find penguins, but no bears. But if you go up into the Arctic, you will find polar bears. So my simple thesis is that Ursa Major may be one of the very constellations that God intentionally created and named as the bear, and that this idea spread throughout civilization as it grew. That's just my hypothesis. But it makes sense. It would explain why the idea of a bear would be universal. And of course, the bear is, Ursa Major is probably what God is referring to in Job 38:32 when he asks Job, "Can you lead forth a constellation in its season and guide the bear with her sons?"
One area where you can see the emotions not hidden but written out in clear is in special creation. The notion that we are the particular objects of the devotion of the creator of the universe, that we're different from the other animals, never mind plants, not just in degree, but in kind. We and the chimps have a common ancestor. They're our cousins. This contention really makes a lot of people upset. Have you been to a zoo lately? Have you looked at what a chimpanzee does? Maybe you're related to chimps, buddy, but I'm not. Well, we can learn about chimp behavior in zoos about as well as we can learn about human behavior in jails. And for exactly the same reasons. They don't bring out the best in us. But when people like Jane Goodall devote themselves to observing chimpanzees in their natural habitats, the chimps get used to them. The chimps have no trouble recognizing after a while that the humans are somewhat inept chimps.
We seem to have a significant cognitive, intellectual, moral, and spiritual difference from our ape-like, if you want to call them ancestors, whatever you want to call them. That there is a significant difference here that I think throughout Dr. Sagan's lecture he somewhat downplays. And so throughout Dr. Sagan's lecture, I think what we're looking at here is a series of what I call, or what he calls, great demotions. From the Copernican principle, the idea that since we are small and we're no longer at the center of the universe, that somehow we are no longer important, we're cosmically insignificant, a thin film on a solitary rock of a solitary lump of rock and metal, as Dr. Sagan has said in Cosmos. So this idea that human beings are insignificant plays throughout his lecture here. As you'll see, he kind of downplays our specialness in a variety of different ways. And this is one way, is by relating our DNA to chimps. And of course, this is the basis for evolutionary theory, that our DNA is so similar, we must have come from a common DNA source. Now, of course, I think Christianity would affirm a common ancestor in that God created us. He used a basic blueprint for all life forms. DNA as in plants and animals and human beings. Now, if you believe in Charles Darwin and what he said, you think that DNA sort of self-generated and created life on its own apart from any intelligent creating agency. I think the better explanation is that God used DNA as a blueprint for all biological life. That we didn't originate from one strand of DNA without any intelligent input. Rather, we originated in the mind of God. He created us. And so DNA is like a blueprint for automobiles. You have the basic plan of an automobile, and it was all coming from the mind of a designer. And so I think that's the difference. Well, I can agree that we share DNA with carrots and chimps and fleas and flies, but I think it's an inference to take that all the way back to a single strand of DNA billions of years ago without any intentional guidance or design or purpose or teleology. So Dr. Sagan concludes that because our DNA is similar with chimps, we are not that special. We are demoted in one sense. This is one kind of demotion, a biological demotion. We are almost the same as a chimpanzee, therefore we are not special. So again, did DNA self-assemble and create life? Or is it God's foundational design or blueprint for life? I think the latter is a better explanation. And of course, Psalm 139 tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that the Creator of the heavens and the earth knit us together in our mother's womb. And so DNA is certainly a knitting, isn't it? An intricate knitting, the work of God's fingers, just like the sun, moon, and the stars and the heavens are. So our very bodies, our DNA is fashioned by the one who loves us and cares for us and creates us, the one who knows us, the one who has given his Son to us. He has designed us for a special purpose. Now, I ran across this a couple of years ago during research for our book, Dr. Sagan's description of the unborn. I want you to notice some of the key words here. Segmented worm, gill arches of a fish, amphibian, gross divisions, newt, tadpole, a tail, a reptilian face, mammalian but somewhat pig-like, a primate, a human cast. This is kind of Sagan describing what the unborn is like. And you notice all these terms that are subhuman, kind of a way of reducing us, trying to go back to that same idea that we're all basically the same biological accident, that we all sort of take on the same sort of non-human sort of biological goo, that we're nothing special. We look like pigs and mammals, maybe a tadpole, but that the unborn really isn't human at some point. And you get this idea that what Dr. Sagan is describing here is somewhat inhuman. We are confused about the origin of human life. When does human life begin? I believe that human life begins at conception, that human life is precious all the way down to a single cell, because Jesus went through that whole process himself. The Creator of the universe humbled himself, became a man through the process of birth, becoming a child, growing up with us, learning our language, becoming human with us, God with us, Emmanuel. And so God affirms life in the womb, outside of the womb, to the point of death. And I think that we are human from conception to death, and Jesus affirms this. So having DNA in common with chimps doesn't explain our origins, the information in DNA, or our significant differences. Take this article published in 2007-2008 in the Genetics Journal, Waiting for Two Mutations. Now, the whole edifice of natural selection is built on the idea of beneficial mutations happening within the genome over time. But these authors conclude that it would take 216 million years for two mutations on a nucleotide binding site to become fixed within a primate lineage. And the authors of Science and Human Origins say that, quote, the mechanisms of random mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift are insufficient to accomplish the needed changes in the time allotted. So in other words, these authors suggest that we need a lot more time in order for natural selection and evolution to be true. There just simply is not enough time in the evolutionary timescales that we do have to explain the wonderful, intricate design and information within our genome. Now, this comes from Dr. Sagan's 1980 Cosmos book, and I want you to notice how he's describing the evolution of life. Notice the highlighted words here. He's talking about appearance, dramatically new forms, breathtaking speed, vertebrates appeared, insects evolved, first reptiles appeared, dinosaurs evolved, mammals emerged, the first flowers appeared, whales arose, dolphins and whales arose, human beings evolved, and then the true humans emerged. So emerged, evolved, arose, emerged, appeared, evolved, appeared, evolved. It sounds like Genesis, doesn't it? That God said, let there be, and there was. I mean, this is kind of the same thing. No one was around billions of years ago, if that's how long ago it was, to see these things happening. And so we take it on inference based on the similarities in our genetics, but that doesn't mean that we all came from one single genetic DNA strand or RNA strand, whatever you ascribe to. Abiogenesis is a tricky field. No one really knows what happened. But here, Sagan, I just point this out to say that Dr. Sagan sounds a lot like Moses here in Genesis when he's saying that this appeared and that appeared and this appeared. So it's kind of faith either way, right? You can have faith in the text of what God says, or you can have faith in what a scientist says about the origin of life and how life came about. But just saying something appeared or emerged doesn't really describe the physical details of how that came about. And Genesis doesn't either. God spoke it and it came to be. So we are sort of blind to the idea of the technical processes of how life actually came to be. And the whole point of Genesis is not how God did it, but that God did it. Now, one thing that is brought up in natural selection and evolution debates is the idea of the fossil record, and we don't have time to go into the great detail of it, but here is Lucy. This is a skeleton made up of pieces that are 3 million years plus or minus. But in the fossil record, whether it's human bones or something in the Cambrian explosion that was 500 million years ago, what you have in the fossil record are fully formed and recognizable body types. So if natural selection were true, what we should be finding in the fossil record are all kinds of wasted calcium bone things that are unidentifiable, unable to be classified, these transitional messes of evolution making all these mistakes. But what we find in the fossil record are fully formed body plans without any progenitors, without any precursor, no mess. It's all like, oh, that's a rib, that's a knee, that's a femur, that's a jawbone, that's a skull, that's a hand. The fossil record is replete with complete body plans. We don't have this great wasting that should be there if natural selection were true and making all these mistakes over millions of years. We should have a scattered littering of things that we couldn't even recognize. Now, this quote comes from Donald Johanson, who discovered Lucy. He says, quote, about half the time span in the last 3 million years between Lucy and Homo sapiens today, about half the time span in the last 3 million years remains undocumented by any human fossils. So between Lucy and us today, there are no transitional fossil species to speak of. There just isn't. But notice between Lucy and our skeleton, whatever Lucy may be, that there are ribs, there are hip joints and skull pieces and arm pieces, fully formed things in the fossil record.
And it turns out that the two species share 99.6% of their active genes. So one way to look at that is 0.4% is a much larger number than we had guessed. And another way to look at that is, you want to know about us? Take a look at chimps. There's a lot there to learn. In any case, the idea of special creation is really an idea for another time. If nothing else but the molecular biological evidence were available, it would be very clear that there is nothing in us that is qualitatively different from our nearest chimpanzee relatives.
So again, throughout the lecture, I think Dr. Sagan downplays our differences. We are significantly different than chimpanzees. We've made sailing boats, and we've made microscopes, and we've gone to the moon, and we've discovered the atom. We've been able to split atoms and know atoms down to their smallest constituency, just about. And so I think Dr. Sagan, again, downplays this idea of our intelligence. And so doing in order to keep the theme that we are not special in the cosmos.
The third adult in our household when I was little was Muruha Farhe, and she was my nanny, and she was amazing, and I loved her, and we had a really close relationship. She lived with us from the time I was 6 weeks old until I was 8, and then she came back for many, many summers after that. She's gone now, but she was an amazing person, and she was a very devout Roman Catholic, and she didn't drive, so my mother and I would drive her to church every Sunday and pick her up. And her priest, Father Tony, often came to dinner at our house, and I remember him well. And she had been, she grew up in Peru, and she had been a cloistered nun in the Andes Mountains for many years. And I tell the story in the book of how she left the convent, which I'll leave for readers. But it wasn't because of a loss of faith at all. She was a true believer her whole life, very devout. And there was no censorship about that in my house. I knew what she believed. She told me her theology regularly. We only spoke Spanish to each other, and I understood her beliefs. She took me to church when we were traveling, especially. She would take me to church with her, which I loved because I like very ornate, fancy places with high ceilings where people are dressed up. And I really like, a lot of the theme in the book is like, I really like special occasions, and I really like, settings where people are getting together and thinking about stuff and talking about stuff. So I loved that. And, because she was very open with me about what she believed, and I knew that it was different than what my parents believed. At a certain point, I had started thinking about this in sort of a philosophical sense, and I was, kind of, I would say, a morbid child in certain ways. Yeah. And one day, I was really interested in the question of death, not really not in like a, I didn't think of it as a creepy way. Maybe if you came upon me when I was 6 years old, you would think it was creepy. But I just was like, this is really astonishing that we're all walking around animated, and then the animation will leave us. And this is just the most, I still think it's one of the most astonishing things about life is that it ends. And so I one day went to my parents and I said, Maruja says that when you die, you go to heaven and you're with God. And you guys say it's like you're asleep forever without dreaming. Who pray tell, is right? And my parents together, like joyfully, in unison, said, nobody knows.
In a letter to his friend William Graham on July 3rd of 1881, Charles Darwin wrote this, quote, "But then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the conviction of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" So the brute fact is, if natural selection is true, there is finally no qualitative difference between chimps with sticks, hunter-gatherers, and astronauts. We are all fundamentally the same. That seems to be the underlying message of what Dr. Sagan is saying here, that in order to maintain his thesis that we are not special in the universe, he has to sort of equalize all of our intellectual cognitive development. Science and technology are the same. Chimps have them, hunter-gatherers have them, and we have it. It's all the same. There really is no distinction.
went on, every human culture, every great philosopher, every scientist, every religious leader, thinking we were at the center of the universe. We put it in various guises in our scriptures, declared the scriptures to be infallible, thereby making it not just a secular but a religious crime to even think about the issue, until in the late 15th century, an astronomer, cleric from Poland named Nicholas Copernicus thought he had an alternative idea, namely that the sun was at the center and the earth, like the other planets, went around it. He knew that this was dangerous stuff, and so he withheld the publication of his book until he was on his deathbed. The Bible says the earth is at the center. We all believe that. And then, as you know, Galileo made a forthright and brilliant defense of Copernicus, based in part on a set of observations from the newly invented astronomical telescope. And the church got increasingly annoyed. Galileo remained obdurate. The princes of the church showed him the instruments of torture in the dungeons. They weren't making any particular point, just thought he'd like to see them. And shortly thereafter, Galileo made his famous confession in which he abjured the abominable doctrine that the sun and not the earth was at the center. Well, the answer is no. We are not at the center, where it looks important, or at least well lit. Instead, we are in, or at least near, an obscure spiral arm 30,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way galaxy, in the galactic boondocks. If you were an intergalactic traveler coming into the Milky Way, what would you think of someone who said, "Excuse me, Captain, that's the center of the Milky Way, it's true, but count out spiral arms with me. See, there's one, there's another one really big and beautiful, there's another one. Then over there you see that somewhat obscure spiral arm? Well, don't look exactly in it, but just a little out of it. See over there? I know it's hard to see. Take a closer look, right there. No, not that one. That one, see? Yeah. The guys who live on that one say they're at the center of the universe, and the entire universe is made for their benefit.
But the myth goes that since Copernicus made the suggestion that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth, we've been demoted, and since then, over the last 500 years, we've backed out. We now see the universe in a much bigger scale, and we're no longer at the center of the universe, and therefore we are not special, and so therefore we are demoted. This is the Copernican principle. But in 1533, 10 years before he died and 10 years before he published his book, his ideas were presented to the Catholic Church. Johann Albrecht Winmanstadt presented Copernicus's ideas to the Vatican in 1533 to Pope Clement VII. So Copernicus was not afraid of the Church. In fact, his opening preface is addressed to Pope Paul III, and he's just expressing his concern that his mathematics are correct. He wanted to make sure his calculations were sound. So he says this in the preface of his book to Pope Paul III. Quote, "I may well presume, Most Holy Father, that certain people, as soon as they hear that in this book about the revolutions of the spheres of the universe I ascribe movement to the earthly globe, will cry out that holding such views, I should at once be hissed off the stage. Reflecting thus, the thought of scorn which I had to fear on account of the novelty and incongruity of my theory well nigh induced me to abandon my project." So he realized how radical his theory was and was hesitant to publish it because he wanted to make sure his calculations were correct. And he realized that a lot of people were just going to hiss him off the stage, or could have at least anyway. But he wasn't afraid of the church. You'd have to know the whole sphere of the universe. You'd have to know every aspect of the universe to know that we are not at the center or that we are at the center. Now, nobody's ever seen the edge of the universe. Well, we kind of have seen the edge of the universe. There's this stuff called the cosmic microwave background radiation. And allegedly, we are told that this light surrounds the universe. We can see it in all directions. We've sent up a couple of satellites, and it's the very distant light from the Big Bang that's left over, kind of like the tendrils of fireworks as they fall from the sky after a big explosion. You can see them sort of dimming and cooling as they fall, and that's kind of what we're looking at in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, this is light that existed at the very early part of the universe, allegedly before there was the Milky Way and our solar system. But what's really wonderful and unusual is that scientists have recently discovered something about the cosmic microwave background radiation that should not be there. In other words, it looks like the cosmic microwave background radiation, light from the beginning of the universe, seems to have the imprint of our galaxy within it. Now, that's impossible. Our galaxy wasn't here in the cosmic microwave background radiation. This was the early universe. There should be no galaxies and stars and people and planets, let alone a Milky Way. There shouldn't be anything there. But what's interesting is that if you look at this line here, I'll use the line as my galaxy. If you're looking at the Milky Way edge on, what astronomers have noticed is that up and above, there's a hot spot up here above our galaxy, and below there is a cool spot. And that's in relation, it seems to be in relation to the rotation of our galaxy. So up here is a hot spot, down here is a cool spot. And when I say hot and cool spot, I'm talking about the cosmic microwave background radiation, the light from the early universe. There's a hot spot up here, and then there's a cool spot. There's a cool spot down here. Now, what's also interesting there's a set of 3 pairs, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, that go this way across our Milky Way galaxy. So you have this hot spot, this cool spot, perpendicular to these hot spots, these pairs of hot spots, what they call the octopoles. So you have hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold going this way, and you have hot, cold going this way. And so it looks like, to astronomers, it looks like the Milky Way seems to be center. Now, I'm not saying that we are at the center of the universe, but this is radically revising this conversation about where exactly are we in the universe? Is our galaxy at the center of the universe? Maybe not. There's more research that needs to be done, but these poles, the dipole and the octopole, and then there's a quadrupole, they look like they're aligned with our galaxy. And this background light of the early universe should not have an imprint of something that came much later, which is our galaxy. So that's a really interesting thing to explore. Was Galileo put in a dungeon? All this kind of stuff. There's so many urban myths and legends out there. It's hard to separate fact from fiction, but I will tell you, I had the privilege of talking to probably the one individual on the planet who probably knows most about this affair today, and that is Brother Guy Consolmagno, the Vatican's astronomer, the chief astronomer of the Vatican. I've talked with him briefly about the Galileo Affair, and this is what Brother Guy had to say.
The true story is so complicated.
It really is.
I'll say only 3 things. First of all, that Galileo was a devoutly religious man, a good Catholic. Even when he had the chance to flee, he didn't. He was dedicated to the truth, and yet he was also dedicated to not upsetting or pulling apart the fabric of the church that he was in, because he had seen that, he was in the middle of the Reformation, and he'd seen that there was an awful lot of bad side effects when you try to do that.
Right.
He didn't want to do that. The second thing was, he was never convicted of heresy. He was never put in jail. The worst that he had was house arrest, and by that time he was in his 70s. For 25 years, he'd been honored for the work he was doing, honored by the very people who turned on him. And that's the third point. Why did he get in trouble? What could he have done differently? And the answer is, we don't know.
Yeah.
There is all sorts of stuff written about him. And every book, you go to Amazon.com, you can find 400 books on Galileo, and they all have a different answer. And my answer is not going to be any better than anybody else's. But what's clear is that he did do everything right, except maybe being a little obnoxious. But hey, He's Italian. We're all that way. It's part of the territory.
Right.
It could be that the affair went out of control because the Pope thought he was insulting him, but he was a friend of the Pope. They knew each other.
Right.
It could be that things got out of control because he made his enemies look foolish, but they made him look foolish too. This is, par for the course.
Right.
One thing that's always struck me is that the Galileo trial, which sort of arises out of nothing. He had gotten permission to publish the book. He'd made the changes they asked him to make. He'd done everything they'd wanted him to, and suddenly he got into trouble anyway. It happened right at the height of the 30 Years' War, and it might have all been entangled in the incredibly complicated politics of the 30 Years' War, which was, a war that enveloped most of Europe one way or another. Huge and horrible and 30 years long.
Yeah.
But whatever it wasn't the church saying science is bad, we should be afraid of it. The fact of the matter is Galileo's science, while groundbreaking and brilliant, also had its flaws. He didn't actually have the goods to prove his point. It flew in the face of the physics that everybody understood at the time. Of course, right. 40 years later, Newton would give us a new physics. It makes more sense. You do the observations that Galileo was doing, and given what they thought they understood at the time, they thought they could prove scientifically that he was wrong. Well, of course, it meant that the observations were right, the interpretations were wrong. That happens all the time in science. Nonetheless, Galileo was a good Catholic and a good Italian and a brilliant man and a Renaissance man, and he's someone that all of us as human beings can be proud of. And the treatment that he experienced is a treatment that all of us, regardless of what side we're on, can be embarrassed about, because it's the kind of bad treatment that's very tempting to do to anyone who we disagree with.
So really, you had Galileo, and then you had Maffeo Barberini. Now, Maffeo Barberini was Galileo's friend before Maffeo became Pope Urban VIII. And of course, there was the 30 Years' War going on in Europe. There was a lot of politics. There was a lot of politics internal to Italy, the city-states and the Medici family. There was lots of things going on. It wasn't just the church being suspicious of Galileo or the church hates science. There was a lot of interturmoil politics going on that we don't have time to get into, but there are many great resources out there for you to look into this. But basically, there was the friendship of Maffeo and Galileo. Maffeo was Galileo's benefactor before becoming Pope. And then, so they were friends. But then, once Maffeo became the Pope, then things got a little heated. Things changed a little bit. Your friend becomes the Pope. You're like, wow, okay. So Galileo wrote a book called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. And in it, most people think that Galileo's character of Simplicio was making fun of his friend Maffeo. And so Galileo seems to have probably crossed a line maybe a little bit by making some fun at it, but if they were friends, maybe he thought Maffeo would take it all in good spirit. Hard to say what was going on there, but anyway, Simplicio is often thought to be related to Pope Urban and Maffeo, and so you have this Simplicio, recant! Really, this was more an argument between two intemperate men. Galileo was known for his temper, and Maffeo was the head of the largest church in the world, and the 30 Years' War was raging across Europe. And so there was all these other complications going on. And so this really wasn't so much about, the church versus science or anything, or science versus faith. It was just more about Galileo, as you heard Brother Guy say, Galileo at the time didn't have the evidence, the full and complete evidence to support his theory.
And then finally, there is a new and, to my mind, bizarre field for this debate, something called the Anthropic Principle, which would be much better called the Anthropocentric Principle, which comes in strong, weak, and various shades of middling flavors. The weak Anthropic Principle says, if the laws of nature and the fundamental constants of nature were significantly different, then the paths which led to us would have been different and we wouldn't be here. That is unexceptionable, certainly true. No problem. But then there is a strong anthropic principle which, to my mind, is dangerously close to the following argument. We would not be here if the laws of nature and the values of the physical constants were other than they are. Therefore, the laws of nature and the physical constants are as they are in order for the universe to produce us. God had us in mind at the time the universe was made, and here we are back at the center of the universe again.
The Anthropic Principle was popularized by a book by John D. Barrow and Frank J. Tipler called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, in which the authors conclude that the universe was finely tuned to allow for biological life, that it was purposely designed to allow for biological life. Now, there are two basic forms of the anthropic principle, the weak anthropic principle and the strong anthropic principle. And the weak anthropic principle, Dr. Sagan outlines this pretty well. He says that if the constants of the universe were changed just a little bit, the weight of the atom, the force of gravity, things of that nature, that we wouldn't be here as a biological species. If you tweaked the universe in any particular direction, changing the forces, the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, the force of gravity, if you changed any of that just a little bit, there would not be biological life. And so that's the weak anthropic principle. If the constants were changed just a little bit, we wouldn't be here. Now, the strong anthropic principle is a little different. It suggests that the constants of the universe were designed for biological life specifically. Dr. Sagan would be of the point that says that biological life evolved and that the constants were not, in fact, designed for us. We just happen to be existing within it because they allowed for life. But Dr. Sagan finds the concept that the constants and quantities of the universe that physics now knows were specifically designed for us in mind. He finds this principle to be bizarre and another example of what he considers to be cosmic chauvinism, that we think the universe was designed for us. But the authors of this book conclude that they believe the universe was designed for biological life to exist. The subtle distinction is the idea that the universe was designed primarily for us, primarily being the emphasis here. The anthropic principle doesn't say that that the universe is all about us. It simply says that the constants and quantities were designed so that life can exist. It's not saying that it was designed primarily for us, that the universe is all about us. That's not it. Biblically speaking, the universe was created for the glory of God, not for human beings. Part of that glory is that human beings share within it, that God designed the universe to be life-permitting, but human life is not finally what the universe is all about. Human life is a part of God's glory, but the universe itself and the design and the fine-tuning of it is all for the glory of God. So the idea of the universe being fine-tuned is not controversial. Dr. Luke Barnes, who appears in our Story of the Cosmos book, who has written a couple of books, one of which is A Fortunate Universe, has written a paper called The Fine-Tuning of the Universe for Intelligent Life. He draws no religious connotations from this. He simply shows and affirms how many scientists and cosmologists and astronomers affirm the idea that the fine-tuning of the universe is a real thing. The cosmological anthropic principle is a real thing. And so here you see all the scientists that Luke cites don't deny that the universe has these finely tuned constants and quantities. Where the controversy lies is, what do these constants and quantities mean? And of course, the periodic table of divinely created elements, this suggests very strongly that the universe was designed, at least for me. All of these orderly elements, all of these have atomic weights, how many protons are in the nucleus of each of these elements. This is a wonderful attestation of God's handiwork and creativity, as Romans 1 says. This is a wonderful periodic, the periodic table was discovered because they saw this atomic weight and this atomic weight and figured, well, if that's a 6, And this is a 12, there must be 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I mean, that's how the periodic table came to be, was the discovery of this orderliness of atomic weights. And so here this is, I think, a wonderful treatise and attestation for evidence of divine design in the cosmos. As the Lord declares through the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 45:18 says, "For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it as a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited." I would agree with Dr. Sagan that the universe is not finally all about us, but it is about the glory of God, and part of that glory is that we get to participate in it. But I don't agree with him that we are insignificant. And here is probably one of the most recognizable images for which Dr. Sagan is most well known. It's called the pale blue dot. Now, the pale blue dot was a photograph of Earth taken by the Voyager 1 satellite on February 14th, Valentine's Day, of 1990. Dr. Sagan was integral in getting NASA to turn Voyager around and take pictures of the planets of our solar system as it was going out of the solar system. And so we can thank Dr. Sagan for this wonderful, iconic image called the pale blue dot. Now here you see this shaft of sunlight, and if you look up in the top right corner there, you can see that little white dot. That is Earth from 3.7 billion miles away. That's the pale blue dot. And of course, Dr. Sagan speaks so eloquently about our smallness in the cosmos when he reflects upon the pale blue dot.
Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one part of the dot on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of another part of the dot. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe seem to me challenged by this point of pale light.
It's interesting how he concludes what the pale blue dot means, that we are deluded for thinking we are important in the universe. He says our delusions of self-importance. Are we really deluded? Are we cosmically insignificant? I mean, I would agree, no one could disagree by looking at this picture, that we are small in relation to the cosmos. We certainly are small, but smallness does not determine that we are insignificant. We've just been, for the last year or so, battling the coronavirus, and the coronavirus is small, and no one would hardly think that it's insignificant, right? It's small, but it's not insignificant. And it's interesting, too, at the end of that, he talks about that there is no hint that anyone will come to save us from ourselves. Well, I would want to ask him, if I were there that night at Cornell, what do we need to be saved from? What is this need of salvation? Where is he getting this idea? And I think anyone can see that you look around at human beings, we see that there is a problem. We have a great moral problem. We don't behave well. We don't act right. We have negative thoughts and things go awry. There's wars and fights and things, and something's wrong with us. And so what is that? What exactly is that? Is somebody going to save us? And if we're the problem, how can we be also the solution? And so he does mention this idea of salvation. But of course, in the Christian scriptures, there is no other name under heaven by which men must be saved. Our Lord Jesus Christ, Acts 4:12. That salvation is found in Christ alone. And he has come to earth as a man and will one day return to earth as the Lord and King of the universe. Now, in Psalm 8, David certainly recognizes that he is small in relation to the universe that God has created. But he comes to a radically different conclusion. We are not insignificant, but we are cared for and loved by God. And so David writes in Psalm 8, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is thy name in all the earth, who has displayed thy splendor above the heavens. From the mouths of babes and nursing infants thou hast established strength, because of thine adversaries to make the enemy and the avenger cease. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou dost take thought of him, and the son of man that thou dost care for him? Yet thou hast made him a little lower than God, and dost crown him with glory and majesty.